lower on the level, and that will just totally cut it out in some areas. Whereas if I go kind of soft, you'll see that very subtly there'll be that kind of tiling. So that's where you need to completely ditch it in parts of the map. Just changing the settings a little bit here. And now you can see that's only blended in at certain parts of the mesh. Now I'm just going to drop once again, the multiply off, because inside this texture, the darkest bits are black, and we know that we don't want it to go completely black here. You can see at about 50%, it's quite dark as is. And I'll just do another render. So I'm going to cancel this because I can't see the effect coming through strong enough. And I'm going to go into the map and just increase this height. And now I'm going to increase the white value. And now we can see that getting blended through a bit more. And I'll try and render again. And now you can see we get areas on the map that resemble the texture, but without that glaringly obvious tiling, which in my opinion it's one of the most kind of rookie mistakes you can make as an artist. Whenever I see a project where they've got like a wall and the tiling is just so obvious, it's kind of just one of those things where you just like drop your head and you're like how did they let that slide? So always do your best to mask textures. And so you can see here, one of the easiest ways to do that is to actually use procedurals to blend in those textures. You could even go to the extreme of, if I just cancel this, you can go to the extreme of copying this map, pasting it over again, and then just changing the angle at which it's, orientated. Then you can obviously use the offset, maybe move it a little bit. It doesn't really matter. And then just use copy and paste that texture, and just play with the different size. Just use totally different settings, and then blend that in that way. And just work your way up, and eventually you'll end up with a really detailed texture that is totally invisible to tiling. But at a certain point you start adding so much detail where it's just unnecessary. We've already got it looking like the real life concrete. So at this point now, I'm just going to totally remove this top layer. I'll leave this on for the sake of the tutorial and showing you guys how it's blended in. But at this point, this is where I'd copy the composite map and go into the diffuse part of the texture and just paste that whole map in. I'm not going to paste it as an instance because now we need to go in and actually modify the values inside these Burcon maps in order to produce the same color that we're seeing in the reference image. So now we need to analyze what type of color is actually showing up on this material and what's causing that color. So we've got things here that in the more blurry areas, for example here, you can see that the brighter areas are actually more blurry, and that's most likely because it's dirt and grime as opposed to concrete that we're seeing there. So whenever you get something that's like a material that's it consists of particles and not a very solid object, it's not like mud has been smeared over the surface, it's very fine grains, that will diffuse the reflections. So we need to associate the darker areas of this map with the more blurry parts of the reflection. Now that's not always the case. Sometimes you might have a bit of glue or something that's accidentally been spread across the surface, and that gives the surface a brighter appearance and a more shiny appearance. So then there's areas which are like this here. So we know that that's not the concrete. That could have been something that spilled on the surface. It could be leftover residue from pretty much anything. Or it could just be the way the material is structured, but you never really know. But until you kind of understand the basic laws of how this is working, you're just going to be guessing. So it's better to do an educated guess than to simply just slap some random, and that's another thing I see a lot of the time also. People don't line up the diffuse values to the reflection glossiness. So inside the diffuse map, the first thing I always like to do is as usual, now that even though we've got these 8 layers here, I want to simplify things. I don't want to overcomplicate it in my head. So I'm just going to turn off all these top layers. And the first thing I'm going to do is try and start to figure out how to get a nice color blending through the surface. So you can see here that we've got areas that appear more yellow and kind of gray, but then there's areas that are appearing a little bit blue and darker. So we're going to, just like we did with the first layers, just one by one go in, and I'm just going to play with darkening things off. So to give myself a rough idea of where to start, what I can do is I can look at this raw render knowing that we've got a value of kind of 58 in grayscale here, and that's producing this look, which is a bit brighter than what we've got here, and we don't have that kind of yellow tone in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that value, go into the diffuse map, go down to the very first base Burcon texture and paste that into the darker areas, and then in the second color I'm going to darken that to around a similar value and just introduce a little bit of color. So in some of the maps I'm going to go more towards yellow, and in other maps I'm going to go more towards blue. But no matter what, I'm going to constantly have that kind of mid-gray value somewhere in the texture, just so that we're not introducing too much variation, because at the end of the day the concrete still does have a very gray appearance to it. So now you can see we're blending between some darker areas and some lighter areas. I can probably go a little bit darker on this and a little bit darker on this other material here, just to create more variation. Now I'm going to copy that value, and in the map above I can paste that value again, and I can go down. Once again we're going to go gray here. Now rather, like I said, we've already got the hue right, but now we've already got the brightness right. Now I just want to change the hue. So that's where I can go slide this over towards the more blue side of things. And you'll see what happens is we start to, as we blend those materials in at a smaller scale, it will kind of shift towards an overall gray tone, but you'll get areas that are more yellow and more gray. Now on this last top layer, this is the one with the very small variations, and you can see in the texture here there isn't actually too much of that small scale variation. So I'm going to be a bit more careful with this top layer, because when you add diffuse variation on smaller Burcon textures, it starts to become very noticeable. So here I'm just going to keep it roughly the same value as everything else, around 40 to 50. And then in the second color, I'll maybe shift it a little bit over to the blue, but I still want to keep it relatively similar. If that's looking good, I can go back towards yellow a little bit, and you can see here in the preview we've got some variation. It's probably a little bit too different in terms of the tone, so that's where I'll just play with that stuff. Maybe drop back the saturation, and now you can see that difference isn't so obvious. And using that as just a very, very rough starting point, we'll see how it looks. You can see the map now has kind of got that variation in it. And if this looks good, then I can start unhiding the layers one by one and focus on what type of, if I want the grungy bits to be darker or brighter. So let me pause the render. So you can see as this is rendering the major difference now that we're having an effect on the image. In these areas here, this is the old single color, and now that we're introducing, you can see some very large differences, then the smaller differences, and then finally the smallest differences. And it all links up to the reflection glossiness also. So in those darker areas, we're either going to go more towards blue, and in the lighter areas, we're going to go more towards yellow. Just like in reality, where everything's synced up. Things aren't just going to randomly produce colors in some grungy parts and brighter in other grungy parts. They're usually darker or brighter for a reason, and you have to pay very close attention to that. So if you stick to this workflow where you focus on the reflection glossiness first, it makes things so much easier to enhance, once you get to that texturing phase. So I can actually cancel this render now. I don't need to see more. Now I just need to start going in and maybe playing with how much I want to blend in some of these other materials. So in this top layer here, this fourth layer, I'm going to unhide the map. Then I'm going to go into the texture itself. And then I'm just going to go in, and this time, now that we're getting to the more detailed areas, we're moving away from the base texture surface, and we're now starting to define the values for the bits covering the surface, covering the concrete, the bits like the dust and grime. Now I can go a little bit more extreme on those colors that I'm about to use. But also remember that just because I'm blending this map in, it is being blended in with an opacity map. But this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the opacity for that layer, and I'm just going to drop the overall opacity down. Actually, you know what? I'm going to unhide it. I'm going to go back up to 100 on this map. But inside the Burcon used to define it, I'm going to drop this down. And in the dark areas, I'm also going to blend it in just a tiny little bit. So I'm just going to load this preview up and just kind of see before and after how that looks. I'm actually going to go a little bit brighter. And I'll do another test render. This time I'm just going to do a region render so I can compare to what I've been doing up till this point. And now that I've added that stronger coloring, all of a sudden it goes from looking a bit more grey to a bit more of this kind of dingy yellow color. You can see V-Ray just bugging out a little bit here, where it's just not letting me use that. So it's probably a good point in time for me to close the scene, maybe restart my computer, and start up again. So looking back on the previous test, I'm just realizing that there's probably not enough of that texture being blended in. So I'm going to go into the map here, and in the brighter areas, I'm just going to raise that and kind of double that value. And then do another region render. And now I can see, you can just see now the difference. One's got this little bit of detail coming through it, and the other doesn't. It's quite subtle, but it actually does make a difference. So this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So far we've been working with relatively dark values, and in this top layer we've once again gone dark and blended it in, so we're kind of, at the moment we don't have any brighter areas of this texture map. So there's a couple of different things we can do. We can either use the top texture map that we've got here, or we can kind of flip this texture we've got going on here and make this brighter to overlay this into the scene. But what I'm going to do is just going to close this preview down. Some of them take a while because they're so complex. And I'm going to set this to addition. And what this is going to do is it's going to brighten up the texture. So if I unhide this, you'll see here that it all of a sudden kicks in pretty strongly. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the texture itself. Actually, I can cancel that. I'm going to go into the opacity map, and I'm just going to darken this quite significantly. And I'm just trying to brighten the map. So if I hide this now, hopefully you can see that little bit of variation that's being introduced into the texture. And now I'm going to add, now I'm going to do another test render and see how this looks. Because I've restarted V-Ray, I'm just going to turn off region render, so I've given myself a large preview to test. And then I can start region rendering again from there. As you can see, now there's quite a lot of variation in this texture map, but we still don't have any of the footprints or anything being much brighter. And there will be parts of the mesh that do go brighter without actually changing the appearance too much of the material. You can see, for example, we've got this weird stuff happening here. So what I'm going to do for that last little bit is let this render finish, multiply this top bit over so that the darker areas are showing up in the map, and then we'll add the final kind of touches using the actual real world texture, and then I'll go in and create one more texture that's separate from the glossiness and blend that over as a dust layer. Okay, so I'm going to unhide this layer on the top here, and what I'm going to do is on the high pass, I'm just going to go a little bit higher to reveal more of that detail. And now that'll be multiplied in a little bit more throughout the surface. And I can probably drop this down to about 80% just to soften that off a little bit. Now I'm also going to unhide the top layer, which is also set to multiply, and I'm going to reduce that down to 25%. Okay, so now like I said, there's one more layer we can add, and I'm just going to add that now and make it a Burcon texture. I'm going to set the size to 8. I'm going to go a bit higher here. I'm going to make it whirly. I'm going to set it to Chebyshev. Similar, the reason I know how to do this is because I've already done it so many times in the past that I kind of know what settings are going to have an effect on the Burcon texture itself. I can't really explain that to you because that's something that's subconscious that happens as you experiment over and over again with the Burcon maps. I'm going to flip this now, and the reason I'm doing that is you can see we introduce that kind of effect. Then I'm going to use distortion to mess this up a little bit. I'm going to add a Burcon noise once again. make it a bit bigger. Actually, I'll just reduce the size of this and change it at the end just so I know kind of how this is looking. I'll just make this 0.05. And actually, I've got to go back up because once again I forgot to make this larger. And we're introducing just kind of little speckles like that. So now I'm going to set this to addition also. And in the map here, in the bright spot, I'm just going to add a little bit of a orange color to this because the dust usually will pick up, you know, a color similar to that. And now, if I drop the opacity down quite low, sorry, it's just wigging out for me here. We introduce that variation to the texture. Can probably go just a little bit darker here. Now if we look at the before and after, you'll see the difference that makes. So now we've introduced dark spots, we've introduced white spots, and there's tons of variation within the texture. So I'm just going to render again. So I'm going to cancel this render because as you can see, as it's going, the dark bits are just a little bit too dark compared to our reference image. There isn't any areas that kind of go below this color here. Whereas if you cut to our render, things are actually quite, you know, quite choppy, which takes away from the realism. You don't want to go too extreme on any one procedural. So going into the map here, I'm going to drop the opacity down to 12 on this map. And on our multiply map, I'm also going to drop that down to about 25 and really significantly drop how much of an effect that's having. Because you can see the difference between 25 and 80 over here is quite extreme. But that being said, the white areas do look pretty good. This just closes anytime this year. The white areas do look quite nice. You can see they do resemble what's happening in the actual real world example. Maybe not perfectly, but like I said, unless you're half blending in procedurals and real textures, you're never going to be able to get something with either or on something this type of scale. If you're that focused on how it, on the realism of the shader. So if you just load up the maps here, you can see there's only 3 different things mapped. The reflection's mapped, the reflection glossiness is mapped, and the diffuse is mapped. Now there's one more thing I can do, and you can see in the reflection fall off, we've got a simple fall off map. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a composite map. And I'm going to add another layer. And what this composite map does now is it gives me control over darkening parts of the reflection irrespective of the angle at which we're viewing it. So if I want to just globally drop the reflection everywhere, I can do that with this method here, with the composite map. So this is where I'm going to once again create an entirely different Burcon texture just to vary things up a bit. Now I'm only going to blend it in a little bit, but it's just going to once again add one more layer of detail that most people wouldn't consider adding. So I'm going to make it a Burcon noise map. I'm going to make the size 2. We're going to use Perlin 3D by default and FBM turbulence. If I just bring this up here, you'll be able to see what's happening. I'm going to bring the levels to 4. change the lacunarity, sorry. See what changing the exponent does. Might just go to 0.5. Now I'm going to add distortion to this texture. And I'm going to make this one quite big. You'll see what type of effect this has. Changing the scale of the distortion has a pretty drastic effect on the underlying texture that you actually are distorting. So keep in mind that. And just before, you'll see I get into a habit of kind of increasing the size too much at the start, but I'm going to drop that down and I'll change that a little bit later. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm just going to go in here and once again change the size of that. So you can see the effect this is having of adding tons of variation. I'm just going to set this to multiply and drop the value down to 12. So now you can see the two reflection maps, the two bits combined together. If I just go up to 100 here. Sorry, sometimes Burcon wigs out. It doesn't exactly show you the correct preview. Basically, all I'm doing is, it's pretty self-explanatory, just multiplying this over the top. So I'm going to do one more render, but before I do that, now that I'm pretty much happy with how the material's looking, I'm just going to go in and enable a couple of those settings like I was talking about at the start. So I'm going to turn on depth of field in the render. And also you'll notice I'm actually using a V-Ray camera, but in order to use the perspective match tools at the start of the scene, you have to use a standard 3ds Max camera. But if you go in and use Lily's or Lele's V-Ray tools, it's a script pack for 3ds Max. You can convert a standard 3ds Max camera to a V-Ray camera. So that's what I did. And then from there, I just went in and enabled those settings on the V-Ray camera. So I'm going to turn on depth of field, and I'm going to enable that bokeh map and make sure that effect exposure is turned off. This will give us that colored noise throughout the render. And it's also going to slow the render down a lot now, because when you add that depth of field to the scene, V-Ray is going to have to use, it only can use, there's no depth of field subdivs value. It's purely sampled with anti-aliasing. So when we've got all the depth of field at the back here, I may need to adjust the settings, but overall they should be fine to work with depth of field. But maybe I can go off on the color threshold a little bit and increase the max subdivs. But overall, we'll see how this looks. You can see in the preview you're getting that colored noise blending through. And another thing to note in this render is I got asked this question when I posted this image. It's when you've got the highlights on the lights. So actually, let me just turn this off and I'll enable bloom and glare. Making sure I've got the intensity mapped roughly around 0.5 to 0.7. Just so that the glare is only showing up on the areas that are quite bright in the scene or on the highlights on the floor. But yeah, in the mastering lighting course, I'll go in, I'll show you how to kind of post-production, because V-Ray doesn't have a very good way of handling the jagged edges on the edges of V-Ray lights, and that's just because the difference in pixel intensity is so great that it doesn't have enough anti-aliasing samples around those areas to fully clean them. So usually, and if you ever see architectural studio producing images where the lights are visible, they've gone in and fixed that in post work, or they've just waited a really long time for the anti-aliasing to sample the edges correctly. But usually it'll be done in post work. So the render's finished, and I'm just going to bring it into Photoshop and add the final touches to it. Even though I probably don't think it needs that much work, I'll just run you through a couple of things you can experiment with. So I've got the render up in Photoshop, and I've got the reference image up also. Now, you might not always have the luxury of having a reference image to make your materials from, but I would highly recommend trying to find something of a similar look and feel, just so you're basing your decisions somewhat on reality. You can't guesstimate this stuff because your stuff won't end up looking that photoreal. So one of the first things I can do here, you can see there are a number of different things contributing to the color in this particular scene. It can be the fact that the walls are a different color, even though we've got those pretty close. It can be the color of the lights, and that's another interesting thing in this scene. You'll notice here the lights are actually different colors. Some of them are blue and some of them are orange. And things like that are the type of detail you need to be looking out for when working on your projects. The reason why those lights are different colors is most likely because over time they've died and been replaced, and you know, if you go a year and a half without a light being replaced, you know what it's like. You end up going to replace it, you can never find the exact same light. On top of that, lights kind of dim over time and lose their power, so that's another contributing factor. So you've probably got every single light here being slightly different. Now, I didn't go in and make every light different. I've just changed the colors of a couple of them. You can see there are some that are more blue than others. So this one's more blue and this one's more orange. But try and pay attention to the little details like that, because like I've said, the entire course, it's not one single thing that's going to make your images look real. It's a combination of everything that's going to make your image look real. So what I like to do is I like to go in, I'll steal an area of the texture or the reference image which doesn't have a highlight in it, and I'm just going to copy that, make a new project. And sorry, I know I can use hotkeys to set this stuff up, but just so that you can see what I'm doing, I just do it this way. Then I'm just going to put a Gaussian blur, or Gaussian. That's another one of these things you realize as a tutor, you start pronouncing everything incorrectly. So once I've blurred that, fairly strongly, I'm going to bring this over the top of my image here, even though it's 32-bit. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this image, make it a bit bigger, and now make that 8-bit. And now I've just got a brighter version of this texture, this render, just in case I need to use that. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this out over the floor, and I'm going to set it to hue. And you can see that's already changed the color here. So let me just close this. It's going to push us a little bit closer to the color we want in the floor. So I can probably drop that back halfway, and you can see it just changes things up a little bit. It's always good just to make sure you've just painted that away from the backdrop. You can mask it, or you can paint it away like that. It doesn't really matter. Alright, so then on top of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a photo filter, and I'm just going to go to a more blue color. And once again, I'm just comparing to the left and right here. And then I'll just drop that back. If it's still too much, you can, sometimes just a subtle difference of 10% is going to be what gets you over the line. Alright, so now on top of this, I can add a curve adjustment layer, and I'm just going to darken it off until it's, roughly the same strength. And once again, if you go a little bit too harsh with things, feel free to just tone them back. And you can see adding in that contrast has just given us a little bit more of, it's kind of softened off the blurring of the highlights. Maybe it's not so physically correct, but at the end of the day, if you're on an ArcViz project, you're never going to match it 100% from each angle, and you're probably going to need to go in and make small adjustments depending on where you're looking at the scene from anyway. So now we've got this top coat layer, and I can just play doing my usual thing where I put that on soft light. Now this is where we're going to get away a little bit from this image on the left here, but as you can see, the image on the left doesn't look very beautiful. It looks pretty dungy and dull, which is exactly why I chose this image to base the render off of, because it's much harder to get things like a bit more down to earth and shot with like a phone camera looking real than say a professional photographer where everything looks beautiful. So adding that layer over the top, I can just drop the intensity of it. And then I'll group everything together, and you can see when we just compare the two, it's just a subtle adjustment, but I mean that is the type of stuff, guys, that these studios will be doing on their images. Every single image will have some degree of post work pumped into it. Now I can collapse this if I really want to, paste it over the top, use a high pass filter, and this is just an alternative way to sharpening your image. I'll just kind of go fairly large. Now if I cycle through here, you can see it's sharpening off the image. And I'll just tone that back a little bit, and it's just going to add a little bit of crispiness to the image. So if I go full screen now, we've got a scene here, and this is the whole point of this part of the lesson, is showing you that even though you have everything else in the scene looking completely fake and simplified, because we've put all this effort and time into the shader itself, no matter what you have going on elsewhere, the shader looks realistic. So we can put in the same amount of effort and quality into the wall shaders, and over time they will become realistic. So it kind of proves a point that it's less about V-Ray making things look not realistic and more about the artistic input getting you over the line in terms of tricking your eye into believing something's real. If you had this exact same floor with a very simple Burcon texture as the glossiness, or you had a repeated tiled texture causing this glossiness, it wouldn't look as real. And you wouldn't be able to use that same shader from different angles where you can see the texture repeating more or less. And you might not even have the glossiness or the power over getting the glossiness correct in a texture map anyway. So I hope you take something out of this. I know it's still not perfect and there's still work you can do on it, but you can see how if you slowly build up the shader as you go, you can still get stuff looking really good in real world examples. So next thing on the list in this lesson, we're going to go in and create this wood material. Now, even though this looks really cool and I got a lot of positive feedback from it on the Facebook post, there's not actually a lot of effort that goes into creating something like this. So this texture was once again taken from VizPark, and it's a single texture out of their collection pack. I'll link you guys to their product page if you're willing to go in and purchase the rest of them. But it's a really great texture pack. It gives me a really great opportunity to show you how even really dusty and apparently non-reflective materials actually are still just as reflective. They're just more glossy. So we'll get into that now. I'll open up the scene file and just run you through how the texturing's worked in Photoshop, and just how I'm approaching looking at the shader and breaking it down. Okay, so now that we're done with that lengthy and exhausting concrete material, we're going to get on to a new topic that I haven't really gone into in the course yet, and that's working with real-world textures in order to create materials. Up until this point, I've only shown you how to really work with procedural materials and sometimes overlaying in textures into those materials. Now, the reason I'm tackling this material in particular is because a lot of the time I see people look at a real-world material that doesn't appear reflective, and then in 3D they don't simulate how that material is actually behaving. So for example, on a material like this, a lot of people won't add the correct reflection amount, and that's going to significantly change the way your material looks and how it's behaving to light. And it can be extremely frustrating when you've apparently, when a material appears simple, but there's actually a lot behind the scenes in order to make it look the way it is. So in this particular material, I'm using a texture source from VisPark once again, and if you remember, they helped out in the last lesson with the plant shaders and stuff. So this is part of their plywood textures pack, and I'll link you to their product page in case you want to buy the rest of these to use in your projects. However, even a company like VisPark, it's not, the onus isn't on them to give you fully prepared textures, because in most cases, the artists who are building these, they're doing it more under the guise that you can modify and adapt the textures to suit your own needs. So there's a couple of small adjustments that need to be done, even to bought materials, and especially on materials you get from other websites like cgtextures.com. So luckily in this day and age though, there's a lot of websites where you can get really high res quality textures from, whether it's cgsource.com, VisPark or Evermotion. There's a lot of websites now that provide really good quality textures, and that wasn't always the case. So with that being said, we'll jump into Max and we'll start breaking down how I've constructed this material and some of the important features that often go missed. Okay, so once again, starting with a simple V-Ray material, and we won't need to use a multi-layered setup anymore. So the first thing I'm going to do is swap this to a microfacet GTR, and for now I'll just leave the tail fall off at 2. Now the first thing you need to do, obviously when creating wood material, is load in the diffuse texture. So if we load up the default texture that you get when you purchase the pack from VisPark, you'll notice that it's extremely bright. And one of the important things when taking textures is that you need to kind of diffuse out that light, and, or more importantly, you need to cancel out that light. So in most cases, if you're getting a raw texture from cgtextures.com or VisPark or Evermotion, they're not going to be perfectly tailor-made for 3D rendering. So there's a couple of things you can do. The first thing I usually like to do is I like to do a quick normalization on the texture. So I'm going to Control A and just duplicate that layer, and then I'm going to put a blur on, and I'm going to use an average blur. Then I'm going to paste the same material over the top of that, and I'm going to use a high pass filter. And depending on the type of texture you have, you'll need to change the radius of this. So for a wood texture, you want to try and find a value where you're getting all the ridges, but you can see here as I go too high, it's almost looking like nothing's happened. And if I go too low, we're only getting tiny little bits of grain. So just find a kind of mid-range value where you're getting all the detail, but you're not overdoing it or underdoing it. It's a little bit hard to explain, but you'll kind of get a feel for it as you go. So once you've put that layer on, I'm going to set this layer to linear light, and you can see what that's doing. And now I'm just going to drop the opacity on that. So now if I duplicate these two layers, you can see we're kind of normalizing out all the colors. Now that may or may not be a good thing, but to undo a little bit of these issues, what I can do is just drop the opacity down. And sometimes textures only need a little bit of an adjustment, but it's enough to be the difference between it looking like you've just slapped a texture on an object and actually making it look photoreal. So you can see with a little adjustment like that, I've kind of leveled some areas out. Now one thing I do want to do is that in the darker areas, I want to mask that off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a mask on here, and I'm going to duplicate that original texture, and I'm going to make it desaturated, then go into the levels and really kind of bring it up here like so. Now I'm going to copy and paste this new layer, and in the group mask, I'm going to go into the channels, hit the eye icon, and paste that in. And now you'll notice that it goes red because that's showing you the masked area. And now if I go back out, it won't affect it as much. You can see the difference there. So it's more the higher highlight areas that we want to adjust. So with that quick, simple adjustment, you can see that we've got a slightly different texture now. Now the next important thing to realize is that in most cases, because they're being lit evenly, they're going to be too bright. So this is where I'll go in and add a curve adjustment layer over the top and darken things off a little bit. Because you have to remember now, say for example in this scene, if I go back into 3ds Max, there's a sunlight in here that's going to once again double up the lighting. So if you're starting with a material that's this bright, you can imagine how over bright that's going to look when you have a light source as intense as the sun landing on it. So now you can see the difference here, and I'll probably just put this underneath. Actually, I'll go above. Alright, so now you can see I've made that adjustment, and this is getting more to how the real world material will look with diffused lighting. So I'm going to save this image off and load it into the diffuse texture in 3ds Max. Okay, I'm going to apply this material, and depending on the type of object, obviously on this shader ball, I'm going to adjust the tiling options so that we've got something a little bit more realistic. But because I did see some of you guys sharing with me materials where you hadn't set the tiling right on the material ball, where things were too big, and that's a very dead giveaway that something's CG. So I'm just going to hit the preview button here. You can see by default, the reason this is UV mapped like this, it's actually not UV mapping, but it's just when you use Power Tools, it's a 3ds Max NURBS plugin that I use to model this sphere. It automatically creates UVs for the surface. So for each you can see that, it doesn't look perfect on the edges, but it does a pretty good job actually. So I'm going to set the tiling to be a little bit more accurate, and now you can see that we're seeing the repetition on the shader ball. So to fix that, I'm just going to change the orientation. Just until that goes away. So at 70, it's looking pretty good. Now the next thing I get asked often is, do you need to blur the texture? Now the answer to this question is that if you're rendering a very close-up material, drop the blur all the way down to 0 because you don't want 3ds Max to pre-filter that. The reason why this blur option exists is because when V-Ray or any render engine is sampling a texture using anti-aliasing, blurring it is going to very subtly soften the pixels together, and you won't end up with such a high contrasty texture. So even though you're at the naked eye level, you might not realize it is having much of an effect. To the sampling engine, blurring a texture actually makes a pretty big difference on render times. Because as I've explained to you in the past, V-Ray's anti-aliasing engine is looking for it's looking for that pixel value you've got here in the color threshold to determine where to add samples. So if you blur that, it's going to change the difference in pixels slightly. So even if it's a 0.02 difference, it can actually speed up your render time 20%, for example, in an extreme situation. So in this particular instance, I'm going to drop it all the way down to 0.01 because I want to see what this material looks like in all its glory. But if, for example, you were applying this to a large scene and it was in the back, in the background, definitely keep that blur value up higher because you're going to make less work for the render engine. Okay, so at this point, I'm just going to render off the material without anything added to it. And the HDR I'm using is another Jorgen HDR. And now I know I've been kind of teasing you guys with his HDRs for all last year, but as soon as I get the V-Ray course finished, I'm going to work with him to get all of his HDRs up on our website once and for all, so that you guys do have some support HDRs to work with on the Mastering Lighting course. So I'm just going to double check my settings, which is something I always do. I don't really do that in the lessons because, you know, in real time, you're trying to make it appear like, you know, you're doing everything perfectly. But if you haven't checked a scene in a while, it's always good just to run through and make sure you don't have anything crazy going on before you sit there and wait 32 minutes for a render when it should actually take 5. So I'm just going to put the noise threshold up a little bit higher here. The global subdivs I'm going to raise to 1. Now I'll show you why I changed that at times a little bit later. And the color threshold I'm also going to put at 1. And I'm just going to drop the max subdiv. So I'm just kind of speeding the render up a little bit. Now I'm also just going to change the render size, and I'll set this off. So now that we've got our starting point, we can start to try and build upon this to get things looking a lot more realistic. So if I go to the specular and reflection pass, you can see there's nothing there, which is totally incorrect for this material. So just because you can't see the reflection doesn't mean it's not there. So the next thing we need to do is we need to go in and add a fall off map into the reflection pass, or into the reflection slot, and start tweaking that. Now, like I said before, there's not really any difference between this material, or there is no difference at a molecular level between this material and its polished variant. So a lot of wood you see is highly reflective depending on how polished it is. So the only difference will be the glossiness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to load a fall off map straight into here. I'm going to enable the color map adjustment as usual. And I believe, based on my experience, and I can't really say this with certainty because on the Refractive Index website there's nothing listed for wood or any materials like this, and I think that's because in order to sample a material like that, it's quite difficult because it's very hard to get a pure kind of unmessy version of a material to get a hold of. But I do believe that wood adheres to a similar kind of BRDF fall off to plastic. So I'm just going to utilize that now and just pull this in. And we'll use this as a starting point. So now you can see that when I load that up, we've got a little bit of reflection happening. But I also need to make sure Fresnel's turned off. So there you go, you can see the materials reflecting. Maybe it should just be a little bit sharper here. And if I drag the reflection glossiness down really far, you'll notice something extremely important happens. All of a sudden, the material becomes a lot brighter. And that's because the reflection is being blurred over the top of it. So if you pay attention here, you'll notice with and without, we get a much brighter result. And once again, this comes back down to knowing how light works and how materials work when looking at textures. So if I take all this stuff off, what we're seeing here is a material that already has reflection on it, and it's already got lighting information on it and global illumination on it. So we need to undo that, and that often means that a texture is going to be a lot brighter than you think. So you can see the difference here. I go from, quite bright to a much darker. And now in here, when I enable that reflection, we get a similar effect happening on the texture itself. That similar, 20% darkness. Now obviously we need to actually use a reflection glossiness map to change the way the reflections are spreading based on the dark and bright parts of the image. So if I go into the texture file, what I'm going to do is over the top of this, and let me just get rid of all these top layers just so you're not confused. I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to add a hue and saturation and just darken that off, and then I'll just add a curve adjustment over the top of this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to experiment, and there's no clear-cut way of figuring out exactly what this map should look like, but for a wood like this, we're going to need to go quite blurry, and there's not going to really be any areas that are catching really sharp reflections. So that's where I'm going to darken everything off quite a lot, but it's also important to realize that the darkest parts of the image are probably not meant to be so dark. So we're going to remove a lot of the contrast in the reflection glossiness map and raise the dark bits so that they're about 10 to 15% pure black. And I'll see how this goes. But because we've got a curve adjustment here, if it's not looking right in the render engine, you've got two options. You can either change it in Photoshop, or you can add a color correction modifier on top of the texture and adjust it in 3ds Max. So let me just save this, and I'll load this inside the material. So I've just loaded this into the map here, and it's probably a little bit too dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into Photoshop and just raise this up a bit. And save it off again. And I can still go higher. You notice I just saved things off as a JPEG, around 11 quality. So there you go. If I turn off the reflection map once again, you can see that difference we're getting there. Now I'm also going to go into the reflection glossiness map and reduce the filtering on that. But now I'm going to go back into the reflection map and just raise this reflection up, because now we've got a bit more blurred. I've lost a bit of that color coming over the object itself. Okay, I'm going to increase the reflection subdivs on the material and just do a region render near the center of the object, just to see the difference we've made. Okay, so just looking at this end result here, I'm just going to the specular and reflection pass. One stupid thing I've done is I haven't set the tiling on the map to be the same as the diffuse map. So I'm just going to fix that and do another re-render. And now you can actually see in the preview the dark areas aren't so bright because they're darker in the actual map itself. They're lining up correctly again. So already you can see what a massive difference that makes to the overall appearance and realism of the material. It's probably the most crucial map in any texture-driven material, the reflection glossiness map. But there's still a couple of things I can do to get this popping a little bit more. So we're going to go back into the map, and I'm just going to drop off the base kind of material, the darker areas, and then I'm going to brighten up, just try and introduce a bit more variation in the reflection glossiness. And I'm just going to save it over the top of the material again. Okay, 3ds Max, when you go back in, should automatically reload that. And now I'm just going to do a full region render so you can see how it's looking so far. It's actually really cool now that you can see here it's got a very dusty appearance, and this new GGX BRDF does a really nice job of simulating that when you've got a small tail fall off and a very low glossiness. It actually makes things look a lot more realistic. And finally we don't need to utilize that multi-layered approach. You can see the specular with this new BRDF, it produces a really nice kind of ridge going towards 90 degrees that the old one does, that it just never had that. So it's automatically making things look more realistic. But also now you can see how the material looks a lot more realistic overall with just that single map. So it just goes to show the importance of it. You can see in the shadows that towards the edge we're picking up reflections, you know, and all this information is being added over the top. However, there's one thing I've noticed, and this is where what I was teaching you earlier in the year about not using a reflection map kind of breaks down a little bit. You can see in the dark areas here, we're too dark. So this is where we need to break the rules a little bit and adjust the reflection in those areas to be darker manually. Because just changing the glossiness isn't enough. You have to assume that, you know, light is actually physically getting trapped in there, and so therefore we're not seeing as much reflection. So as usual, I'm going to make this a composite map, add a new layer to it, and this is where we need to go into Photoshop and create a new texture from this one we've got currently and use that to multiply over the top. So I'm going to turn off my previous adjustment curve and add a new one. And this time I can go a bit higher because this time we're multiplying down. So I really only want to darken off the brighter parts of the material. So you know, just tweaking these settings. I'm also trying not to completely remove the reflections from the dark spots. That's why I'm raising the low points. So that now when we multiply that over, there's still a little bit of reflection going into those crevices. Okay, I'm just going to save this off and then see how this ends up looking. Once again, I'm just going to make sure that those are set up correctly. Now you can see on our material here that we're using this map for the reflection, but if I multiply this in, then we're kind of cutting out the reflection where we don't want it. Now I'm just going to go into the reflection. Now that we've multiplied down some parts, I'm just going to move the reflection up a little bit. And you can see if I move the reflection extremely far up, we're getting that effect in the dark spots. It's less reflective. But wood won't have a BRDF like that, so you still need to stay kind of somewhat within the realm of realism. Alright, now I'll render one more time and see how this is looking. And there you go, it's already looking much better. So just with those two maps, we've started to really define how this material looks, and once again I'll just reiterate, now that we've got the reflection set up correctly, even though we darkened off that diffuse part of the texture, it's looking more like the original now than it would if you just went straight to using this map. And this same principle can apply to any material you're creating. If you've got a texture of, you know, a totally different type of wood, you can just apply this similar principle of just darkening it a little bit and then adding the reflection over the top. As long as the material's reflectivity isn't too drastically different, say for example like a colored metal, then it's going to be pretty easy you'll get pretty good at just very quickly determining how dark you need to go on the map. Alright, so the next obvious thing to do from here is to add a bump map to the object. Now bump maps don't work perfectly for objects that require a lot of detail. I do find that V-Ray's bump mapping system is long overdue for an overhaul, And if you really want to see a render engine that has an amazing bump engine, check out Modo, because about a year or two ago they changed their implementation, and in some examples it looks as good as displacement, whereas I've never really gotten that type of quality out of V-Ray. But there's one little trick that I like to do, and maybe it won't apply to you architectural visualization guys where you've got massive scenes with tons of objects, but definitely in the print industry where if we needed to make an object out of wood, I'd just go in and add a little bit of displacement. And you can see I've got that turned off here on the object. But before I do that, we just need to make the bump map. So I'm just running you through a kind of very basic workflow that I've been adhering to for a couple of years now. It's not that complicated, but just so you're aware of what I'm doing, I'm sure a lot of you guys, do pretty much the exact same thing, but I've just got to run through this for the guys that are less experienced in terms of setting up textures. So now we're going to add a third curve, and this will be the one that defines the bump mapping. Now it's important to realize we don't need bump mapping everywhere. If I take this off and go back to the original, there's parts of the mesh here you can see where all these little dings and stuff aren't actually having any effect on the object. So we only want the bump to appear as it would in the reference image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly mask off half the image so that I can start to adjust this curve and do it knowing that the areas where I don't want bumps, there's none coming through. So as I brighten this up towards 1, you can see here that adjacent to it, the areas where I don't want bump go fully white, and then the little crevices, they do have bump. So you end up with an image that looks kind of like this. You've only got the bump appearing in small places. And then if you want, you can darken it off a little bit more just to enhance that effect. And now I'm just going to delete that layer mask and save this off as the bump map. And now you can see the effect that's having. Once again, I'm going to take off the blur amount. Set it up correctly. Now, a good value for bump mapping, I've never really seen a material that will require bump mapping going above a value of 10 when set up correctly. A lot of people try and add too much bump to the surface, and that's a good indication that your scene's not balanced correctly. So what I mean by that is either your material's too not reflective enough and you're trying to pull out the highlights kind of just with brute force bump mapping, or your material's overly reflective and you're just trying to, I don't know, it's hard to say, but a lot of the times just try and stick to a value of 0.01, which can sometimes make a lot of difference when you've got a direct V-Ray light hitting the surface, and say 10 for a very rough, grungy surface. But to start out here, I'm just going to set this to 1 and see how this looks. And as always, I'll just do a preview render on a small area so I've got something to compare to. But take note on these highlights here on the edge, we're not getting much of a kind of ridge effect happening. And you can see now, some people were saying in the comments of the Facebook post that surely you can just use bump. But if you look at the highlight along the edge of this surface, you can still see, regardless of the bump mapping, that it's extremely smooth. So I'm just going to cancel this render and just go a bit higher on the bump mapping. I'll try a value of 5, And there you go, you can see on the right here we've got the bump mapping happening, and even though I've got a very small value of 5, it's making a massive difference to our scene. And then on the left we don't have any at all, and you can kind of see that it's just doesn't have that little bit of extra realism in the shader. So moving on from here, you've seen me do it before in lessons 4, part 1 and 2. I like to go in and add a little bit of dust on surfaces like this, so that in the areas down the bottom here, it's not so it would just add a little bit more detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a V-Ray dirt map to the diffuse part, keep the old as a sub map, move that straight to the unoccluded color. Then in the occluded color, we're going to make this a very bright kind of white cream to simulate that dust effect. I'm going to drop the radius down to 2 centimeters and really increase the distribution, so we're crunching that fall off on the radius itself. Now I'm just going to copy this diffuse map and make a V-Ray light material just so I can make sure that I've got the right value set up. And I'm just going to render this off because we're about to set up the dust fall off here. So as you can see, we've got a nice kind of fall off there, but the problem is this fall off is very uniform and even, which dust doesn't usually do. So I'm going to use the radius function inside the V-Ray dirt map to define how far that's spreading out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a composite map as usual, and then load a Burcon noise texture inside of there. So now this next map I'm creating will define the overall radius. So I'm going to leave it at Perlin 3D and just set it to FBM to create that kind of soft, dusty look. Then I'm just going to change the settings just to make it a bit more crunchy. And I'll re-render this. So there you go. Adding that map there just creates a little bit of randomization. But it's important to realize that when you set the radius up, the difference between black and white, the white part is saying the maximum radius can be whatever you set in the radius parameter, and the black bit is 0. So I'm going to set the radius now to be a little bit bigger. Like so. And I'm also going to drop off on the distribution. And we get a bit more of a fade, so I can even just go a bit further down there. Okay, so from here what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this V-Ray dirt map, go back into the materials diffuse part, and then paste this into the radius. Sorry, paste the radius. And it actually doesn't need to be, I usually just set a composite map up in case I need to go in and add extra layers, but this has actually turned out quite cool, so I'm just going to copy that over the top. And now we've simply got a Burcon map. Now what we need to do here is, when adding dust, is we need to remove the reflection from those areas. So in the composite map here of the material, I'm going to add another layer and paste this over. Sorry, once again, I've kind of stuffed up a little bit there. I'm going to copy this dirt and paste that over the top, and we're going to set this to multiply. So now the occluded areas, I want them to be black, and the unoccluded areas I want them to be white. So now it's saying in these areas where the dust is, remove the reflection. And I just need to remove the wood texture because I only want that to mask off the dust. So now if I apply this texture to the surface and see how it looks, you probably won't notice the dust that much because we've already got a color similar to that. But if you had a light kind of rotating around this object, you notice little features like that. So you can see here we've got it coming in the diffuse part, and in the reflection it dulls off. So it's a little bit too strong at the moment. So there's a couple of things I can do. On the distribution here, you can see I've got this set up incorrectly. So I'm just going to make sure that when I go back into the diffuse part, I soften that off also. And now I'll try again. And it's still appearing the same. So in order to fix that, I'm just going to double the radius and drop the distribution down to 2. And now I'll have to go in and do the exact same on the reflection. And we'll see how that looks. Actually, there's one thing I'm going to do here. In the diffuse part, I'm just going to grab the occluded color and just make this a little bit darker. It's just a little bit too obvious at the moment. And now you can see it fading off a little bit better. Okay, there's one more thing I'm going to do, and you don't have to do this, and I certainly wouldn't recommend doing this unless it was very obvious material close to the camera. But I'm just going to go in, and what I like to do is I add a V-Ray displacement modifier and set the mapping to 2D mapping, set the resolution to whatever the resolution of the texture is. In this case, it's roughly 2048 pixels, and then I just set the value to a very low, so it's 0.005. And then on the shift, I'll put the exact same amount. So it's pushing in, out, outwards 0.005, and it's also shifting that in 0.005. I'm going to load up our bump map texture and drag this to a slot over here. I'm just going to drag this down to 0 and set that up correctly. Or you can simply just instance it from the bump mapping slot here, depending on if you change the displacement map. Alright, so that pretty much just wraps up how to create that material. So you'll notice it doesn't look exactly like the image I had in Photoshop. So let me just render this high res, and I'll just show you once again a quick little the post work that I do to make it pop that little bit more. So inside Photoshop, you can see how the raw renders come out. First thing I'm going to do, as usual, duplicate the layer, add an exposure adjustment, and just make it a bit bright. I'm just going to drop off the gamma correction a little bit, and then I'm going to make this an 8-bit layer. Now when I make that soft light, I can kind of just tone it back a little bit. And you can see the really cool thing it does with the shadows here is it just makes them, it gives it a little bit of a tinge, towards the center it goes darker. and it also gives the image that really nice glowing feeling. So this works really well with some renders and not as well on others, but overall you start to get a feel now for why I always use this technique, just to pop things. You can see the extra realism you get here. Alright, so on the base layer 2, I just want to add a sharpen filter just to give things a little bit more of that realistic pop. Now whenever you have a photographic texture on your material, this is a good way just to enhance that and get back a little bit of the crispiness that you lose in the filtering process. I know you've probably seen this all a few times from me by now, but you just want a small radius on it. And then from there I'll just add one more curve over the top and try and pull some of that color into the image. And if it's going a little bit too bright, I can just pull up on the base here and then darken that down. Actually, I'm just going to very subtly move this up. So at 100%, you can see all of a sudden it just looks quite nice. And you go from that to that. Alright guys, that wraps up the first part of this lesson. I'm going to get the next part out ASAP. I've already recorded a few of the scenes, or a couple of the scenes from that next part, where we're going to be dealing with some white wall paint and some reflective woods. So here we've got a very blurry one. Then I'm going to go in and make one that's a little bit more typical and standard and do a real world test on that. Thanks heaps guys, and I'll see you in part 2.